The Battle of Lake Khasan, and also known as the Changkefeng Incident in China and Japan, was an attempted military incursion by Manchukuo into the territory claimed by the Soviet Union. This incursion was founded in the belief of the Japanese side that the Soviet Union misinterpreted the demarcation of the boundary based on the Treaty of Peking between Imperial Russia and the Qing dynasty China, and furthermore, that the demarcation markers were tampered with. Background: for most of the first half of the 20th century there was considerable tension between the Russian, Chinese and Japanese governments along their common borders in what is now northeast China. The Chinese Eastern Railway, or was a railway in northeastern China. It connected China and the Russian Far East. The southern branch of the CER, known in the West as the South Manchuria Railway, became the locus and partial casus belli for the Russo-Japanese War and subsequent incidents leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War, and a series of Soviet-Japanese border wars. Larger incidents included the Sino-Soviet conflict of 1929 and the Mukden incident between Japan and China in 1931. The Battle of Lake Khasan was fought between two powers which had long mistrusted each other. The confrontation was triggered when the Soviet Far East Army and Soviet State Security Border Guard reinforced its Khasan border with Manchuria. This was prompted in part by the famous defection 1 month before of Soviet General G.S. Lyushkov, in charge of all NKVD forces in the Soviet Far East at Hunchun, located in the heart of the Tyomin River area. He provided the Japanese with critical intelligence on the poor state of Soviet Far Eastern forces and the wholesale purge of army officers. Build up. On July 6, 1938, the Japanese Kwantung Army intercepted and decoded a message sent by the Russian commander in the Poziet region to Soviet headquarters in Khabarovsk. The message recommended that Russian soldiers be allowed to secure previously unoccupied high ground west of Lake Khasan, most notably the disputed Changkefeng Heights, because it would be advantageous for the Soviets to occupy terrain which overlooked the Korean port city of Regin, as well as strategic railways linking Korea to Manchuria. Within the next 2 weeks, small groups of Soviet border troops then moved into the area and began fortifying the mountain, constructing emplacements, observation trenches, entanglements, and communications facilities. At first, the Japanese Korean Army, which had been assigned to defend the area, disregarded the Soviet advance. However, the Kwantung Army, whose administrative jurisdiction overlapped Changkefeng, pushed the Korean Army to take more action because it was suspicious of Soviet intentions. Following this, the Korean Army took the matter to Tokyo, recommending that a formal protest be sent to the USSR. The conflict started on July 15, when the Japanese attaché in Moscow demanded the removal of Soviet border troops from the Bezymyanaya and Zaozhyurnaya hills to the west of Lake Khasan in the south of Primory, not far from Vladivostok, claiming this territory by the Soviet-Korea border. The demand was rejected. Battle. The Japanese 19th Division along with some Manchukuo units took on the Soviet 39th Rifle Corps under Grigory Stern. One of the Japanese army commanders at the battle was Colonel Kotoku Sato, the commander of the 75th Infantry Regiment. Lieutenant General Suetaka Kamizo gave Sato an order: "You are to mete out a firm and thorough counterattack without fail, once you gather that the enemy is advancing even in the slightest." The hidden meaning of this was that Sato had been ordered to expel the Soviets from Changkefeng. On July 31, Sato's regiment launched a night sortie on the fortified hill. In the Changkefeng sector, 1,114 Japanese engaged a Soviet garrison of 300, eliminating them and knocking out 10 tanks, while taking casualties of 34 killed and 99 wounded themselves. In the Shachofeng sector, 379 Japanese surprised and routed another 300 Soviet troops, while knocking out 7 tanks. and suffering 11 killed and 34 wounded in the process. After this, thousands more Japanese soldiers from the 19th Division arrived, dug in, and requested reinforcements. High Command rejected the request, as they knew General Suetaka would use these forces to aggressively assault vulnerable Soviet positions, thus causing an unwanted escalation. The Japanese troops instead settled for defending the disputed area. The Soviets gathered 354 tanks and assault guns at Lake Khasan by this time, including 257 T-26 tanks, 3 St. 26 bridge-laying tanks, 81 BT-7 light tanks, and 13 Su-5-2 self-propelled guns. In 1933, the Japanese designed and built a Rinji Soko Resha. The train was deployed at 2nd Armored Train Unit in Manchuria and participated in the Second Sino-Japanese War and the Chankafeng conflict against the Soviets, transporting thousands of Japanese troops to and from the battlefield, displaying to the West the capability of an Asian nation to adopt and implement Western ideas and doctrine concerning rapid infantry deployment and transportation. On the 31st of July, People's Commissar for Defense Clement Voroshilov ordered combat readiness for 1st Coastal Army. Pacific Fleet was mobilized as well. The chief of the Far East Front, Vasily Blucher, arrived at the front line on August 2, 1938. Under his command, additional forces were moved to the zone of conflict, and from August 2 to 9 the Japanese forces at Chankafeng were subjected to very heavy attacks. Such was the disparity of forces that one Japanese artillery commander observed that the Soviets fired more shells in one day than the Japanese did in the entire two-week affair. Despite this, the Japanese defenders organized an effective anti-tank defense, with disastrous results for the poorly coordinated Soviets. The Soviet assaults were repeatedly beaten back with heavy casualties. Thousands of Soviet troops were killed or wounded, and at least 9 tanks were destroyed and 76 damaged to varying degrees. On August 10, Japanese Ambassador Mamoru Shigemitsu asked for peace, satisfied that the incident had been brought to an honorable conclusion on August 11, 1938. In 13 hours 30 minutes of local time, the Japanese stopped fighting and Soviet forces reoccupied the heights. Consequences: more than 6,500 Soviet officers and soldiers were awarded the orders, decorations, and medals of the Soviet Union. Soviet losses totaled 792 killed, missing and 3,279 wounded, according to their own records. And the Japanese claimed to destroyed or immobilized 96 enemy tanks, and destroyed 30 artillery pieces. Regardless of whether or not these claims were true, Soviet armored losses were significant, with dozens of tanks being crippled or destroyed, and hundreds of tank troops becoming casualties. Japanese casualties, as revealed by Secret Army General Staff statistics, totaled 1,439 casualties. The Soviets, however, claimed Japanese losses of 3,100. The Soviet losses were blamed on the incompetence of Vasily Blucher. On October 22 he was arrested by the NKVD and later thought to have been tortured to death. The Japanese military, while seriously analyzing the results of the battle, would later engage with the Soviets once more, with disastrous results. In the more extensive Battle of Khasan in the Soviet-Japanese border war of 1939, this second engagement resulted in the defeat of the Japanese Sixth Army. Following the end of World War II, at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East in 1946, 13 high-ranking Japanese officials were charged with crimes against peace for their roles in initiating hostilities at Lake Khasan. Bibliography. Cox, Alvin D. The Anatomy of a Small War. The Soviet-Japanese Struggle for Chankafeng, Khasan, 1938. Westport, Con. Greenwood Press, 1977. ISBN 0-8371-9479-2.